Hey YouTube, welcome to this week's video. I'm Aaron Ross, and this week we're talking about ISO. Now this is the last video in a 4-part series where we've been talking about the exposure triangle. I'll link up the whole playlist up there for you if you want to start from the beginning, where we give an overview of the exposure triangle. Then we go into what aperture is and shutter speed, and now we're wrapping it up with ISO and how we can use that to appropriately expose our photos. Now I want to be clear that what I'm talking about is for photography. All three of these can be used in videography as well, but they all function a little bit differently. So for photography, you have your shutter speed and how fast. I wonder if you can hear that. Can you hear that plane going overhead? Right when I try and record. Now as a quick recap, you have shutter speed, and that determines how long your shutter is open and therefore how much light is getting into your sensor. You also have aperture, which is how wide your lens opens up to again allow different amounts of light to hit your sensor. Now ISO is a little bit different because it's sort of the sensor in and of itself. And now it may help to understand the history of ISO and what it meant in the film days, because it's the standardization of how sensitive film was. And so here I have Ilford HP5 Plus. It's a black and white film, but on it you can see that it says ISO 400. Now you could also get film stocks that are ISO 100, 800, 1600, and these numbers determine how sensitive the film stock was. That told you, is this a good film stock to use indoors or outdoors, and what other settings, your shutter speed and aperture, do you need to use to get the appropriate exposure when taking a photo using that film stock. But now that we've switched over to digital, things are a little different. Our sensors aren't changing its sensitivity, although that can help in thinking about how to use ISO and the numbers associated with that setting. It really isn't the sensor changing its sensitivity. What's happening is the camera is deciding how bright your image should be based off of that number. With most modern cameras, that number usually starts around 100. That's their lowest base ISO, and it moves up from there. So at 100, your image is going to be the least bright. And as you move up to 200, 400, 800, 1600, it's going to get brighter. Now you would think, why not just use a brighter one if that's what we're trying to get done, especially in low light situations? Well, there's a trade-off. As you make the image brighter using your ISO, what happens is you introduce noise into the image. And we're going to show some examples of that in a minute, but it really means that you're introducing grain and this digital noise that doesn't look very pleasing, and it's not something you can usually deliver to a client. And yes, sometimes you can fix it in post, and sometimes you have to do that based on the lighting situation that you're in. But it's always best to use the lowest ISO you can to get the cleanest image possible. So let's head over to the iPad and show you some examples and what ISO can do to an image. All right, so to look at a few photos and how ISO is impacting your images, what I did is I set up one image on a tripod, and then I started playing with the settings. And this will give you a good overview of the entire exposure triangle, as well as how ISO directly impacts your images. So here up in the corner, you're going to see the settings in which I took that particular image. Here, what you can see is one, I'm using the X-T3 in the 35mm f2. For every single image, I was at f2, so I was as wide open and letting as much light in as possible. And then what I did is I started at the base ISO for this camera, which is 160, and then I used the appropriate shutter to expose that image correctly. So in this image, at that really low ISO and at f2, this was a really dark room, and so what you can see is that I had to go all the way to a quarter of a second to get the correct exposure. Now I could never get this if I was handheld or if my subject was moving. To do that, I would have to increase my shutter speed, therefore let less light in, and therefore need to increase my ISO if I wanted to leave that aperture as wide open as f2. So here you can see that this is a clean image zooming in on the background, which is really where we're going to see some of that digital noise start to creep in later images. But here there's really none. It's a nice clean image. Moving up, this is now ISO 400. So I've increased from 160 to 400, therefore making the image brighter, but I then increased my shutter speed from 1/4 second to 1/10 of a second. So again, correctly exposed, and still a clean image and not much digital noise. But if you look really closely, you can see a little bit of it starting to creep in. Moving up, we've now gone to an ISO of 800, so doubled the brightness of the image, and therefore had to double our shutter speed. So now we're going from 1/10 to 1/20 of a second. And really look up in this section is really where we're going to start to see some digital noise in the next few images. We're now up to 1250. So here you're going to start to see some of this digital noise really start to come through. And this can be edited out. This is enough that I would still be okay delivering this to a client, but I'm starting to see it when you really pay close attention. Now at 2500, you can see it a little bit more. Again, I'll zoom in and you can see just a lot of that digital noise coming in, a lot of those little red and green spots popping out just per pixel. And then when you really get up there, I'm going to jump all the way to 6400. Now you can see a lot of digital noise coming in, very grainy, and this is on the edge of being able to be delivered to a client. Particularly as you go up further, the highest that this camera goes is 25,600. This is just a completely unusable file. Even here in the middle, it is a disgusting looking file. You can see all these artifacts and all sorts of stuff going on there. Not what you want in a high quality image. So again, going all the way back to our first image at ISO 160, the lowest that this camera goes to, you really do get a clean image, and it's all about the trade-offs. So keep that in mind as you're using this setting and trying to get the correct exposure of your images. Well, that is going to do it for ISO. I hope that makes sense, that you now understand that the higher you increase your ISO number, the more bright an image is going to be, but it also introduces a little noise and some of the trade-offs that may make for your images. But as always, play with this yourself. Do exactly what I did and set up your camera on a tripod and play with your settings. Obviously, the way that you use this is going to be different in different situations, so just experiment. Because remember, it's always about getting started. So go ahead and give this video a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and remember to just get started.